Hello and welcome. Welcome to everyone filling in. Roberto, start your video. I'm gonna do a brief introduction as we get started. Hi, welcome everyone. If you are here for what is certain to be a fascinating conversation on the gentrification of psychedelics, you are absolutely in the right place. Thank you for joining us today at Alta Live, and really a warm welcome to all of you. Today's guest is Roberto Lovato. Roberto is a journalist and author who, in his latest for Alta, which is right here, brought readers to San Francisco's mission districts and the communities that have been using psychedelics to heal generational wounds. He's here today to talk about the gentrification of psychedelics, specifically in San Francisco's Mission District. But he's going to give us the history, the past, and he's going to be in conversation with Alta contributing editor Gustavo Arellano. Gustavo is a features reporter for the LA Times and a regular presence in the pages and in the Zoom events for Alta. Before we begin with Roberto and Gustavo, some brief housekeeping. Alta Live, which you are in right now, is the digital interview series we do here at Alta Journal. My name is Beth Spotswood. I'm Alta's digital editor. If you're unfamiliar with our magazine, we are an award-winning quarterly focused on California and the West. If you like what we do here today and the kind of conversations we have with these amazing writers like Gustavo and Roberto, I do hope you'll check us out at altaonline.com. There is a Q&A button at the bottom of the screen to ask questions for Roberto and Gustavo. They will chat for about 30 minutes, and then we're going to get to as many of your questions as we can. This video is being recorded. It'll be posted to altaonline.com later this afternoon. And we're also going to shoot you an email with anything that comes up, including a link to Roberto's article where you can buy his amazing book, Unforgetting, links to Gustavo's work. Anything that comes up, we're going to hook you up with information on how to learn more about it all. So stay tuned for that email later this afternoon. There's also a chat feature here in Zoom. I'll turn on closed captioning as well for anyone who'd like to check that out. But please, let's get the chat started, if you can, by letting us know where you are Zooming in from today. Before I turn it over to Gustavo, I will say hello from Novato, California, just north of San Francisco, where Roberto is. And again, with that, Gustavo and Roberto, take it away.
Thank you so much, Beth. Hey, Roberto, what's up, man?
Hey, Gustavo, I'm happy to see you again. My other favorite place in California, LA.
No, totally. And I got to start by saying, when I read your article, I got happy, first of all, because, hey, seeing you in the pages of Alta, that's awesome. Another brown person in our pages. We need more brown people always. And then I'm like, okay, I'm going to trust Roberto, even though I don't really care about psychedelics. Honestly, I'm a borracho, no soy marihuanero. I've never used any sort of psychedelics in my life. But I read the story. It honestly, and I don't say this porque somos compas, it was one of the most remarkable stories I've read in years. Like these intersections of gentrification, of San Francisco, of psychedelics, indigenous history, fascist history, the future, trauma, all these different intersections. So just what an incredible, remarkable article that you did, man.
Gracias, Gustavo. It's a reflection of, as you know, as writers, we are nothing if not echoes of all the different currents of consciousness that we're exposed to. And I think I just try to do my best to reflect, kind of to do in words what Santana does in music, because that's why people love Santana's music, right? Because there's so much in that music, so much history, Chicano history, Black history, hippie history, immigrant history, just San Francisco at that moment that Santana went to school with my brother, Omar.
Yeah.
So my story is as much an homage to that moment in San Francisco and California history as it is a kind of a cautionary tale.
No, totally. And that's the thing, like, there's been so many stories told about the mission before. I would have never thought a psychedelic history of the mission. And then if I think of psychedelics, you always think of San Francisco, Jerry Garcia, the whole movement of the 60s and whatnot. I would never think of it from a brown perspective. And I think that's just what makes the article so powerful. Again, all these different intersections. And I got to say, great writing as well. And with the title, and I want you to just explain the title, The Gentrification of Consciousness. I saw, I'm like, damn, That is a fucking title right there.
Thanks. No, having grown up in the mission, I grew up around people who even now say, man, things have really gotten gentrified since 2015. And I'm like, oh my God. I was born and raised on Folsom Street, down the street from the projects on what used to be called Army Street, and then became Cesar Chavez. And, you know, for us, gentrification started, you can look in the pages of like El Tecolote newspaper that's still alive, and you can see that gentrification really started around 1973 with the advent of the BART station, right? Which started bringing people into the mission and displacing massive numbers of Latinos. The other major motor of gentrification was Silicon Valley, right? You have all these different companies like Ampex starting to give birth to what became the Silicon Revolution. And so a lot of those workers started coming to the mission and started displacing people as early as the knock on the door of my friend Hiram Vasquez's house, apartment, crowded immigrant apartment in the 1980s and even late 70s. So, you know, I'm very familiar with the physical displacement of Latinos. And then I'm also familiar with the history of psychedelics, thanks to the mission, because, you know, I grew up listening to Santana and looking at that album, Abraxas, for example, the cover on Abraxas, which was by Maddie Carwine, and my brother went to school with him, and psychedelics were all in the air, as were the Black Panther consciousness in Presida Park, right where Santana lived, right across the street from Presida Park. And hippies, I had hippies next door. And even though I wasn't doing psychedelics as a 10-year-old, I was conscious of this epic moment in the history of what people at Santa Cruz University call the history of consciousness, right? There's a program called History of Consciousness at UC Santa Cruz. So, you know, that's kind of part of the Bay Area. That same consciousness gave birth, in fact, to Silicon Valley.
Yeah.
If you look at the fact that Steve Jobs, even a square ass like Bill Gates and others were influenced by, you know, people like Ganem Hubbard, who was the Johnny Appleseed of Silicon Valley, who would go around distributing in a leather satchel bag, you know, doses of LSD to engineers to expand their minds about how to approach virtual reality.
I like the term that you use, crack the ribs of reality, to be, or something like that, to be able to bring all of these things. And your article does all of that. And I want to, let's go all the way from the start, because you kind of define what with psychedelics, with expanding your mind, so to speak, in 3 different phases. And so I want to go through all the phases. So let's start with the first phase, of course, when it was psychedelics was in the realm of the indigenous people of the Americas, was immediately castigated by the Spaniards, but still survived for centuries. Yeah.
So yes, you know, students of psychedelics, some students in the Western frame, because that's one frame, right? There's a whole indigenous frame that you can go and talk to my friends in Mexico, for example, the Huixarica peoples, like, you know, my friend Santos de la Cruz, who's a Huixarica leader, you know, will look at history very differently. They don't even use the word psychedelics. They use, you know, hikuri. That's what they've called for millennia, for like, you know, there's been use of what we call psychedelics in the Americas for at least 6,000 years, according to archaeologists. And it was always tied to the land and to the culture and to rituals, whether it was the Maya, the Aztecs, the Olmecs, Mazatecs, the peoples in ancient, what we now call Peru, or other places, using ayahuasca and other places. These practices have been intimately and integrally tied to culture and history. And so then you have, in the modern era, when, you know, you have the coming of the nation state that defines modernity and borders and bordering peoples off from their land and private property, you suddenly get this thing called the Renaissance in Spain and Italy and France. And the dark kind of underbelly of the Renaissance was the Inquisition, the Spanish Inquisition, whose main exponent here in the this part of the world in California was a guy named Junipero Serra, who used to have
His statue.
Statues all over the 280 freeway and Golden Gate Park, and now they're being toppled. So he was leading the Spanish Inquisition in this part of the world, and the Spanish Inquisition is in fact the de facto beginning of the first drug war in the Americas and arguably in the world, where the use of medicines, of rituals, of song and dance becomes demonized, literally. And so I'm tracing the line that runs from, the building of Mission Dolores Church that founded San Francisco in the mission, to the fact that my parents were married in that church, Mission Dolores, and now, and raised me and my brothers and my cousins, some of whom went to prison because of drug charges, with this continuation of the Inquisition, which is the drug war.
Yeah, totally. Then you get into the second phase. You brought it up and you've talked a little bit about it. You growing up in that second phase of psychedelics, where it starts becoming part of the American consciousness, but still demonized. So we're talking about the Timothy Learys. We're talking about, LSD. We're talking about what, it's going on in San Francisco, the Summer of Love and all of that. And you're growing up right there in the middle. What do you think that era then brought to, how did that change the original intention of psychedelics in the Americas?
It changed and it didn't change some things. The pattern of erasing indigenous, Latinx, and other non-white peoples from the history of psychedelics was already afoot with the hippie movement, because the hippie movement was largely a white thing.
Yeah.
Right? The Summer of Love. There were some exceptions, and they'll trot people out to show the exception, but by and large, Black people had to have the Summer of Soul that we just all saw, that gorgeous movie, right? Well, if you look at the center of that movie is Sly Stone, Bay Area person who hung out in the Mission, who radicalized R&B with psychedelic dress, psychedelic sounds that became funk, that Prince and Parliament and all these other groups followed, and I mean, him and James Brown, right? But the Bay Area makes these mighty contributions to the transformation of the Motown look and sound, where you have Stevie Wonder being little Stevie Wonder and being like, wearing these shiny shoes.
Intervision Stevie Wonder. I mean, even the name Intervisions, that alone says, psychedelia in there.
Exactly. So then you have the transformation of all these different artists because of largely the influence of Sly Stone and another gentleman you might have heard of named Jimi Hendrix, who is, whose history has been whitened, right? Because we look at him as an expression of rock music, when in fact, his primary influence, in addition to psychedelic, were R&B and blues, right? And so in the similar vein, you have Carlos Santana here in the, in the Mission, expressing all these different currents at that moment. He was linked to the hippie movement, but he was also an immigrante from Jalisco, right? And who grew up partly in Tijuana and then migrated here as a kid to go to school with my brother and to absorb all these different currents that are crossing. The other thing I'll say about the hippie era is that erased out of that history is the story of people like Claudio Naranjo, who was a Chilean researcher who basically brought an understanding of ayahuasca to the United States. Salvador Roquet, un Mexicano from DF, who is one of, along with people like Stanislav Grof, a Czech researcher, the people that helped bring about the fusion of psychotherapy and psychedelics, which is now one of the major driving forces of this new third wave of psychedelics, which, they're, it's kind of their thing. If you look at it from an indigenous or non-white perspective, the three waves is kind of just a white narrative, a white periodization of the history of something that's a spectrum that goes back millennia. So you reduce a millennial consciousness to this first phase that you've kind of erased, or you trot out some brown person or something to kind of say, hey, we're in line with you, like some of the liberal think tanks, researchers, authors, right now are talking. They've completely erased us from our own fucking history. So part of my job in telling the history of the mission was to kind of show that, God bless Michael Pollan for writing this book, but he just came around to this neighborhood about 7, 8 years ago. Some of us have been in this neighborhood for 10, 20, 30, 50, 60, 70 years, and then millennia if we go back to the indigenous blood in our DNA and our ancestors.
And that was a trip to me when Michael Pollan did release that book about his own experiences with psychedelia. I thought, like, Pollan, omnivores, the dilemma, now he's starting to drop acid and whatnot. And at that point, of course, now we're at this third wave where you have pharma, where you have tech bros, where you have billions of dollars trying to come in, trying to, quote unquote, legitimize psychedelics as a way for therapy, as a way to treat trauma, as a way to expand your mind. Meanwhile, as you argued, in the mission, it had been happening all this time, but it was always underground because the powers that be criminalized it. And now all of a sudden you have all this big money fighting for the legalization. And where does that leave the people who have been practicing it all of this time? It leaves them not just on the outside, but in very real danger of not being able to access that so easily that they had underground for so long.
Yeah, there's a study out of the University of Connecticut that looks at the last 25 years of psychedelic research and who's been benefiting and who's not. Like, you have a lot of ketamine clinics right now, where the cost of the treatment is anywhere from $400 to $2,000 per session. So that's not something that people are going to give up their rent in the mission to live in a crowded apartment of like 5 to 10 people, right? In this gentrified, hyper gentrified, cosmically, electronically, super mind-blowing gentrification that has no equal on earth kind of gentrification. So, I hear your question. I think about a guy I met at the world's only LSD museum of LSD blotter, where it's in the mission,
which I didn't know, by the way. That was awesome.
And there's I met a gentleman there, in addition to the founder, Mark McLeod, a very great guy who grew up in Argentina. Mark had a friend, Tim Tyler, and they're doing like this movie called The Secret History of LSD. And Tim had just gotten out of jail when I met him.
Yeah.
He'd gotten out
like for 24 years. Yeah.
For refusing to turn in his dad on some things, and for LSD, dealing in LSD. And so, I talked to him, and then, it's heartbreaking to think that this man gave up 25 years of his life in a screwed up, one of the many screwed up prisons along Highway 99 here in California, like Soledad or any of these other
Chowchilla,
neo-fascist prison industrial warehouses for humans, right? So, to think that he had to give up that big chunk of almost half of his life to something that now Compass is going to make billions of dollars out of, or something that, people like Trump supporter Peter Thiel are going to make billions of dollars. And so, I wrote the article also to kind of like alert about this framing of this Renaissance, right? Where the fuck did you get that term?
Yeah.
Renaissance. The Renaissance was a precursor to fascism. If you look at the Inquisition and the way it literally demonized, burned women, attacked,
enslaved all of that.
People, justified the destruction of Jewry, destroyed indigenous life. So, the insensitivity, the lack of consciousness about, is reflected in that phrase, the psychedelic Renaissance. And
go ahead, and I'm going to read something. But go ahead.
So, like, I'm also like, this is also a cautionary tale, because people like Peter Thiel are promoters of what's very clear here in the San Francisco is what I call digital Darwinism. So, for example, those statistics I showed about psychedelic benefits, and let me just say, as a person that's been doing the medicine for 40 years, who's had to overcome personal home trauma and war trauma because of my, work that I did in El Salvador during the war there. I have a profound belief, passion for the things that treat these horrific things like rape, domestic violence, end of life issues, depression, things that have proven, resistant to any other medicine, have met their challenge with psychedelics if properly, dealt with in terms of like what they call the set, your mindset, and how you go into it, and the setting, the people you're with, and how you deal with it. And to think that that's being denied to the ancestors of the people that brought that consciousness to the world.
Yeah.
Right? People in Mexico, people in Peru, people in Central America are the ones that brought a lot of these medicines, not all of them, to world awareness. Now their descendants are not benefiting. And it's interesting because if you look at Silicon Valley employment statistics, where Blacks and Latinos are employed something on the order of 3 to 4% of all these companies like Twitter and Facebook, you have a parallel in the access to the medicines that would help people deal with the racism of Facebook and Twitter and the displacement.
Yeah, they're excluded from using la medicina, as you call it. I'm going to get to that term in a bit. And they're at the same time while they're getting gentrified. I'm going to read this amazing passage from your story really quickly. Gentrification of consciousness creates a situation in which Latinos and other non-whites have either zero or limited access to psychedelics. Accompanying the access problem is a spiritual extractivism, which great term, that has white and upper-class psychonauts, explorers of alternative states of consciousness, building careers, organizations, and for-profits by mining the ancient and contemporary pasts of non-white cultures. The gentrification of consciousness often involves stripping the journeys to altered states of all their historical, cultural, and religious significance and commodifying them in the mill of mass consumption. And in the non-white corners of the mission and other parts of the country, it also involves erasing people from their own history of occupying that spiritual space, a history that needs to be unforgotten if there is to be any shot at anything resembling psychedelic democracy. And you could have easily been very pessimistic, very dark about it, because there's so much to be angry about. But you start with optimism. You start with an activist in the mission, anti-gentrification, and seeing like the war is gone, we're done. And then she uses la medicina, and all of a sudden there's hope again. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, I draw my example from people like a guy mentioned earlier, like Santos de la Cruz, a Wixárika leader, lawyer, in northern Mexico, the Wixárika peoples, some people call them Huichol, but the Wixárika peoples don't like that term. So the Wixárikas are facing a situation in which not only are they having to face big agribusiness, right? And remember, the Wixárikas are the last protectors of peyote. So they were among the people that helped bring about peyote into the public mind. So Santos, I talked to him a few weeks ago, and he's telling me about they're facing down big agribusiness, big mining, and other extractivist powers from Canada, from the United States, and other places. The Mexican government, which supports these corporate things, narcos that are 6 people were just killed a few weeks ago, and to deliver another blow, psychedelic tourism, where you go on Thrillist or Gwyneth Paltrow and even
here's the best place to get ayahuasca in Peru.
Will Smith and all these folks, they're like, they talk about these things as if there was nothing to do with indigenous people except trotting out somebody they've given a lot of money to be an official shaman. I mean, you have a parallel process in California, according to my sources that have educated me about these terms like spiritual extractivism that I learned from people like Bia Labate, who's in the story, who heads up a great organization called Chacruna, another person associated with it, Diana Negrin, whose father was kind of a foundational figure here in the Bay Area around kind of the Mexican medicina connection. And so if you talk to Santos about what's happening there, they've survived in the underworld for millennia. And so in the mission, similarly, you have clinics like Clínica de la Raza that my friend Juan Cruz, who I interviewed for this story, I just mentioned him as Juan. I should have said Juan Cruz. He kind of got bothered with me because I didn't put his last name in there. So Juan, I'm putting in your fucking name now. So Juan Cruz and the leaders of Clínica were going to Mexico, to Huautla de Gutierrez, Huautla de Jimenez, to meet with Maria Sabina and her people around her to learn the way of the medicina, of the magic mushroom that was also being, that was brought and discovered by a researcher named Wasson, who just happened to be on the payroll of the CIA. And so again, I think it's also a cautionary. If I would have had to add to this, I would add stuff like what Stephen Kinzer writes about in his book of 2019 book, The Poisoner in Chief, which is about a guy who's one of the most sinister people in the history of US consciousness. He worked for the CIA, and he and others helped bring about this program called MK Ultra.
Yeah.
Which was a sub-project like 42, I think it was called, had these safe houses that the CIA established around San Francisco. And the CIA would go around and pay sex workers to attract people from the mission and other neighborhoods, people that were displaced or unhoused, or people that were just regular, housed people with, an interest in whatever. They would bring people to these safe houses and they would feed them LSD and other substances to experiment with them like guinea pigs. And so I connect, if I had to write more to this article, I would connect that underbelly with kind of some of the earliest researchers of psychedelic substances in the modern era in the Western European and US frame are Nazis, Japanese, kind of Japanese imperialists during World War II, both of which were recruited by the CIA to help understand how to use chemicals. And so San Francisco was used as a guinea pig place for. So there's this epic struggle, I think, which is kind of my point, and one of the points in the piece, that we're at an inflection point in the history of consciousness. These are powerful medicines, and there also can be powerful weapons in the wrong hands.
Yeah.
And we have to kind of arm ourselves with preparedness in different ways for this thing, because you're going to have Facebook. You already have Facebook sending people ads about, like, if you start using your computer and to search for ketamine or something, you may notice that you're going to get ads for things. People like,
not only that, like you say something on your phone, and your smartphone's always listening to you, then magically these ads come about. We're going to open up to questions now, folks. I'm going to have one more question for Roberto, and it's on this term. We talk about psychedelics, this and that, but throughout your article, you call it la medicina, and you also don't italicize it, the medicine. Why that term?
Well, there's a movement afoot that among Latinos to not italicize anything, because when you write, you don't say, I use the medicina in quotes, right? You just say, I use the medicina, and it is how we talk. So it's kind of like a decolonization at the sentence level. And so similarly, I think, people like folks at Chacruna and the Huixarica peoples are talking about the decolonization of psychedelics. The way that, part of the decolonization, for example, is another term I learned from a woman named Daniela Herrera, a therapist here in the Bay Area with Sage Institute, talked about spiritual bypassing. The fact that you can be all into ayahuasca and LSD or whatever, microdosing, increase your productivity, invest in Compass, do research think tanks, but completely ignore the struggle of Santos de la Cruz and the Huixarica peoples, or the peoples in South America and across the Americas, who are being killed, beaten, tortured, disappeared. So I think it's my stories as much about, kind of sparking a a part of the imaginary, the decolonizing imaginary, and bringing it to psychedelics. An important thing that, we're about to legalize a number of psychedelics in California. So like the Black Panthers, like Funk and Sly Stone, like Silicon Valley, like hot tubs, and a lot of other beautiful California creations, psychedelics are not created here, but California is going to make an outsized contribution to that, to the psychotherapeutic and other implications of psychedelics. And we have to be in on this, not this marginal 10% whose history has been completely erased.
Yeah, no, totally. And kudos to Alta for not italicizing La Medicina. And it's a great way to think of, again, not spiritual extraction, but thinking of these psychedelics as medicine. So Beth is on. That means we have questions from the audience, folks. Start asking them.
We actually have, Carol asks a great kind of follow-up. Will the legalization of these drugs cut off supply to those who have used them for years on the down low, and how so?
I don't have the answer to that question. I'd be able to, I'd write about it if I had the answer, but one of the only according to people I trust in the kind of open psychedelic community are saying that, let's look at what happened with marijuana. Let's look at the political economy of psychedelics. Who's getting ketamine and who's not? Who's investing, and what added, I guess the question I would say is, what added value does, if you look at it from a millennial perspective, like not millennials, the generation, but the millennial peoples of the Americas, what value do corporations add to the millennial consciousness? Why should I reduce, like if you ask my friend Santos, like, why should we reduce our rituals, our community spirit and approach? The teepee ceremonies here in California, that a lot of Chicanos and indigenous people engage in, and other forms of community that have existed for decades here and hundreds of years in California and millennia across the thing. Why should we give a shit about the added value that corporations bring to any of this? Why? How, and we should be concerned that you're reducing this millennial practices and consciousness to an app. You can go and look up psychedelic apps if you can Google it. So I don't know. And I'm not opposed to decriminalization. I think having cousins and friends that have done time for possession and selling what Compass and Peter Thiel and other questionable, even neo-fascistic interests, if you bring in Donald Trump and his and Mercer's support for, investments in psychedelics, it raises a lot of questions. So I have more questions than answers on that.
Okay, I have more questions as well. Robin asks, how can therapists, counselors, and doctors refrain from adding to the gentrification of those in marginalized communities while also offering psychedelics as potential treatment plan?
Beautiful question. Beautiful, beautiful, because as someone who's benefited from what I feel was the thoughtful, conscious, race conscious, class conscious therapy that I was given after the war in El Salvador, for example, by a person in the mission, I can say that you can do your homework and really not separate, because the mainstream, even liberal ideology of psychedelics has a racist core. Just look up, like on YouTube, videos that some African-American therapists have pointed out about the racism at the core of a large part of the psychedelic community, the liberal psychedelic white community. So I think, we can be conscious of class, race, gender, history, erasure, and think. I think the way that you can do it is think about a decolonial. What does it mean to have a decolonial framework for psychotherapy and psychedelics? That's to the best of my knowledge. Or what, honestly, is the setting new when Timothy Leary came up with the term? No. Indigenous people had a mindset. Indigenous people had a very particular setting, the land, and their connection to it. It's now being uprooted, literally. right? By modernity. And so we're trying to use the medicines that are being uprooted from the land that originated them and the culture that originated them, and trying to bring them into the urban setting, which is why I was putting this in the mission, right?
We're getting a couple of questions on this. Any opinions, Roberto or Gustavo, on what the non-psychedelic analogs that some of the startups are creating? Is there a place for them, and could that further endanger the sorts of underground and traditional uses that you advocate?
What are
for?
non-psychedelic analogs? I'm sorry,
I don't know either. Gustavo, do you know anything about that?
I think they're saying, I take it more just honestly the indigenous industry, so to speak, where you do have these traditions, these the exotification of the indigenous people of the Americas and turning them into multi-billion-dollar operations. The most recent example, of course, is Dia de los Muertos, which I'm sure, Roberto, in the Mission District used to be one thing, and now it's become like everyone with the calaveras and like, oh, and all of that stuff. And I just recently, oh gosh, where did I read something? It wasn't Roberto's piece, but something about this effect of as an indigenous person having witnessed the demification of our culture for so long, and now all of a sudden to see people making a quick buck out of it, like, the dissonance and the frankly, the disgust of that.
Ooh. Yeah, well, if that's what it's about, I have too much to say on that, but I wrote a piece on Dia de los Muertos for Latino Rebels. I hate to mention another outlet, but I do write as a freelancer. So
good people.
I wrote a piece about the death of Dia de los Muertos. Is another cautionary tale.
We can share it.
Latino rebels.
Okay, great.
Yeah, the death of Dia de los Muertos or something. And, I got approached, we were there holding up, Dia de los Muertos, I grew up, remember, at the time that I'm growing up, Santana's playing in a garage band, in a garage, literally, right? Down in these alleys by our apartment, our crowded immigrant apartment. There's these mothers walking around with candles and their kids, these mostly Mexican mothers, walking around with candles, doing this death thing that I thought was weird when I was a kid, right? What's that about, Mom? And my mom broke it down for me, and Salvadorans have their own version of this. And so I was like, okay, that's cool, it's ours. And then suddenly, Chicano artists, God bless them, started popularizing Dia de los Muertos, and you started creating art. And then, little unbeknownst to them, I guess, because I don't know if they would sanction this, it became commodified, the commodification of death and of the ritual of death, that then became this thing that, when I wrote that article, something like 10,000 or more people are walking around, mostly white, with, painted faces and stuff, in Dia de los Muertos. And so that's an example of the commodification that awaits us, I think, with psychedelics. I don't know that the corporate domination of psychedelics that is on the precipice right now is going to do anything good for us.
Yeah, no, that's one of the reasons why I found your article so powerful, because I did know that the indigenous, our ancestors, used peyote and used ayahuasca and all these different ways to open up their mind, but I had never read that the framing of the history of psychedelics through that indigenous perspective. And then what you're talking about today, Roberto, just the total erasure of it. Like even the guy who had at the Museum of Acid, he tells you, hey, by the way, did you know that one of your Salvadoreño compas, one of your brothers was crucial in that? I'm like, that is such an amazing history, these hidden histories. And now we're at the point, commodification, gentrification of all of a history that a lot of us embraced for so long. It was ours, and now that people are like, the extrication of that is no longer going to be ours.
That's why I titled this book Unforgetting, right? My article is an act of unforgetting. I got the term from two places. One was from the German philosopher Hannah Arendt, who, when she's trying to understand the workings of memory and fascism, right? How the way that amnesia is necessary to create good soldiers. Just look at the absolute lack of consciousness in your border patrol agents all across the southwestern United States. All these brown people that have no sense of their history, que son una fucking desgracia, quite frankly. Let me just say it. That look at them and look at cops. The amnesia of, you need to have that identity for the state to create you in its image. So Arendt theorized that, we needed to kind of unforget to fight fascism in the realm of memory. In the same way, in America Latina, there's and in Spain right now, like you have that movie Parallel Mothers with Penelope Cruz, which is great because it's about this Latin American and Spanish struggle for memoria histórica, historical memory, where the excavation of the forgotten and the use of it for the pursuit of justice is a necessary part of political struggle right now in the realm of culture and memory. So I try to do that with this Alta piece.
I'd like to end actually with a little bit of criticism we're getting in the comments and let you both kind of respond to it. It costs money to do research and gather data to prove to authorities that these substances can be used responsibly and legally to treat a variety of mental health conditions. Mental health is a bigger problem than ever coming out of the COVID, and psychedelics can be a part of the solution, helping a larger part of the population if there is investment in research. I'm a bit disappointed in the frustration and anger coming through in this webinar. How do you both respond to that?
Go for it, Roberto.
Well, I love you, whoever you are. You know, I love you, whoever you are, because you have feelings like we do. Except if you're white, your feelings are validated. If you're white and middle and upper class, you are among the 90% of people who are the only benefactors of these medicines. Gustavo and I come from a group that, along with Black, Latinx, and indigenous peoples, are less than 10% of the benefactors of these powerful medicines that have been now in our communities for, you know, in the official community for decades. So what you hear, I'm not opposed to research. I'm not opposed to funding. I would prefer other funding for research than funding tied to Peter Thiel, who again is, in my opinion, a neo-fascist in Silicon Valley, who's normalizing some of the most dangerous thought on earth when he's an admirer of another theorist admired and who worked with the Nazis, Carl Schmitt. And these people, the people that are in the white supremacy movement right now share a lot of ideological interest with Peter Thiel, the Mercers, and they also share an interest in psychedelics. Again, psychedelics are not just a hippie leftist thing. They are they can be used for, they were used by the CIA, they're used by the people that, like in Charlottesville, some of the leaders in the white supremacist movement, some of the leaders involved in January 6th, there's an article out there. I can't quote it directly right now, but you can do your research.
I mean, I think the point,
psychedelics.
Yeah, I think the point you're making is that if used responsibly, you have all these benefits, but they could be used irresponsibly and bad things happen. I like Beth's comment, Beth Weingartner, who says directly to the person who responded, talking about this idea of responsibility, indigenous people already knew that these plants and remedies were effective. The only reason we need that, quote, research is because white culture doesn't trust indigenous wisdom, which I thought, like, ooh, damn, that's a good one.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with
We've
that.
been using it for thousands, well, not me, but our ancestors, other people have been using it for thousands of years, and we've been pretty okay. All of a sudden, once you have the Inquisition, once you have the American government saying, that's wrong, the people who have been using it for all this time, to me, I mean, you want to tie it into the present day, to me, it reminds me of the whole issue of like street cart vendors in San Francisco, in California, saying like, oh, these street food vendors, those tacos, they're unhealthy. You have to trust a 5-star restaurant. It's like, nah, these taqueros, they know what they're doing. These eloteros, we know what we've been doing. We've been doing it for hundreds of years, but because it doesn't align with your views, somehow we're bad.
And I would add to that, Gustavo, that I mean, part of the point of my article is just to kind of, to again, an act of historical memory, an act of unforgetting that, hey, you know what? You don't know about Claudio Naranjo. You don't know about Salvador Roquet. You don't probably know about Maria Sabina, except that this guy who was funded by the CIA, Wasson, helped discover magic mushrooms so that you could go do your research. So like, I paint the mission in as beautiful a way as I could, because my neighborhood of origin was one of the most spectacularly gorgeous places on earth in the 1960s and 70s in particular for what I could witness because of, and you see the remnants of it on the walls, right? You see the walls in the Mission. The Mission is home to the world's highest concentration of murals. There's over 500 murals within like a square mile of the Mission. People love to come and, hey, let's have tacos and tortillas in the Mission, and you know, and they love Santana's music and other things that are in the Mission. But meanwhile, my family, my cousins, my friends are being displaced by the Silicon Valley researchers who are living in the Mission now, alone in these Victorian apartments that used to be occupied by entire families like mine. So I'm sorry if my history offends you. I'm just trying to show the beauty and the power of the moment and the potential, because all that beauty and power had a psychedelic component. I'm going to get responses. I've gotten responses from kind of Latinos who are more right of me on issues of psychedelics, for example, and who have think that it's, that's not a good thing to be dealing with. We get enough without that. So, it's like, I'm just showing like, look, you can't deny the psychedelic power of the 60s and 70s in San Francisco and in the Mission among Latinos in psychology, in art, in politics. I mean, revolutionaries like my friend, not play revolution, but actual revolutionaries, who picked up arms, trained here in Bernal Heights with rocks in their backpacks, and go and risk their lives for others in Nicaragua. Friends like my friend Roberto Vargas, one of the founders of Mission Cultural Center, before he went down there, he hung out with Timothy Leary, and Timothy Leary turned him on to some LSD and gave him some training on it. And so then you have like this psychedelic hippie revolution meeting actual, Marxist-Leninist revolution in the Mission. I had a similar experience about a decade later with the Salvadoran Revolution and mushrooms that I took before I made that decision. And then when I came back injured by that war, I came back to the medicine to help me process the most abysmal things there are in life: war, genocide, mass murder. And so, none of this is part of the kind of, hunky-dory kind of research-based, hey, let's join Gwyneth Paltrow in some ayahuasca trip down in South America.
Or Malibu, for that matter.
Or Malibu, or one of these gentrified Victorian apartments that my friend used to live in the Mission.
Thank you for taking that on. And the chat, it's so great that the conversation that your article has sparked is exactly the point of, I think, what Alta hopes to do and why we love working with you, Roberto, and Gustavo, for that matter.
My pleasure.
And with that, we are out of time, but this has been so enlightening and exciting, and you both are just razor sharp. So wonderful conversation. Thank you to everyone for coming. Before you go, let me please invite you to next week. We are hosting Will Self, a writer who will make his case for why the Oscars and Academy Awards are completely obsolete and hypocritical. So join us for that conversation next Wednesday, February 9th at 12:30 p.m. Again, we're going to send you a link to all of this, including where you can read Roberto's article and buy his book, Unforgetting, which is magnificent. Again, thank you so much for participating and engaging with us today. And Gustavo and Roberto, we are very grateful.
Thank you, Gustavo and Beth and Alta, my editor Blaze, who I was an awesome pleasure to work with on this piece, who really added value to what I was doing. And I look forward to continuing this conversation because I think we're at an inflection point, and we all, whether we use or not, we need to be in on that conversation. We can't afford just to have white liberals defining, white liberals, and then their fascist, neo-fascist counterparts in Silicon Valley, like Peter Thiel, defining the future of psychedelics with their money and their discourse. So, it's about emancipation and freedom. Nothing
Gracias.
else. Thank you.
Many thanks. Take care, everyone.
All right.
Stay safe.
Thanks, Gustavo.
Take care, man.